Japan did not learn to fear the United States Marines because the Marines were fearless. Fearless men make mistakes, fearless men rush, fearless men burn out. The thing Japanese officers began to notice in the Pacific was worse. The Marines kept functioning after the point where a normal unit should have come apart. Cut off from supplies, officers dead, radios smashed, maps useless, men sick, wet, hungry, and bleeding. And still the attack kept moving. Still the line bent back into shape. Still some private or corporal seemed to know exactly what had to happen next. That was the part Japan had not planned for. Not American courage, not American firepower, not the flag photographs that would come later. Japan had planned for all of that. What it had not planned for was an enemy whose structure did not live only in headquarters. It lived inside the men. The first hard lesson came on Guadalcanal. In August of 1942, the 1st Marine Division landed on a hot, diseased island in the Solomon Chain because of one unfinished airfield. On paper, the landing looked fragile from the beginning. The Marines did not have enough supplies. The jungle was already attacking them with malaria, rot, insects, and heat. Then, only days after they came ashore, Allied cruisers were destroyed off Savo Island, and the Marines were left staring at the sea with the awful knowledge that the fleet they depended on had been driven away. To Japanese planners, that should have solved the problem. A force on an island without secure supplies should weaken. A young division under pressure should lose balance. A beachhead without naval confidence should become a graveyard. Japan had used that logic across Asia. Speed, pressure, shock, and night assault had broken stronger-looking armies before. Singapore had fallen. The Philippines had been taken. British, Dutch, and American positions had collapsed in a chain across the map. So when Colonel Kiyono Ichiki led roughly 900 men toward the marine perimeter on the night of August 21, he was not acting like a fool in his own mind. He was applying a method that had worked. A hard strike in darkness, a direct assault, spiritual force against exhausted men. At the mouth of the Ilu River, that method ran into something it could not bend. The Marines waited behind wire, machine guns, mortars, and rifle pits. They did not panic at the sound of the charge. They did not empty themselves in one wild burst and collapse. They adjusted, they fired, they shifted, they killed in a pattern. By morning, more than 800 of Ichiki's 900 men were dead or dying near the sandbar. A Japanese unit had attacked what it believed was a weakened enemy. It found an enemy that had already learned how to fight while weakened. That difference would haunt Japanese reports for the rest of the war, because Guadalcanal did not become easier for the Marines after that. It became a test of how long men could keep thinking inside misery. Rain turned foxholes into black soup. Boots rotted, skin broke open, food ran short. Sleep became something men borrowed in pieces. Every night carried the possibility of another attack through the trees. Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake and the Japanese 17th Army tried to correct the failure. The next assault would not be a simple rush. It would be larger, more careful, and better coordinated. In September of 1942, Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi brought thousands of Japanese soldiers through the jungle toward the ridge south of the Marine airfield. That ridge was narrow, coral, grass, and jungle, a spine of high ground above the darkness. The Marines holding it, under Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson, were exhausted. Some had already been through raids and patrols that would have drained a fresh battalion. They were outnumbered by almost 4 to 1. To the Japanese, the plan made sense. Attack at night, hit the ridge in waves, break the thin marine line, then roll down toward the airfield. But on that ridge, Japan met the second lesson. A marine defensive line was not a wall. A wall breaks when you crack it. This was more like a living net. When Japanese troops pushed through one point, Marines on the flanks closed around them. When an officer fell, a sergeant pulled men into the gap. When the darkness split units apart, small groups still fought toward the same purpose. For roughly 9 hours, the ridge burned with grenades, rifles, mortars, shouting, and close killing. By morning, Kawaguchi's force had lost around 2,200 men. Edson's Marines had suffered heavily too, but the ridge still held, and because the ridge held, Henderson Field held, and because Henderson Field held, the campaign began to tilt. This was not the kind of victory that looked clean on a map. It was uglier than that. It was a victory built out of men making correct decisions in broken situations. That is what Japanese officers kept trying to explain. The Marines were not simply stubborn. Stubbornness can be surrounded. Rage can be tricked. Bravery can be spent. But trained competence is different. Competence does not need to feel brave. It only needs to know what comes next. And that was the secret Japan was only beginning to see. The Marine Corps had spent the years before the war preparing for exactly the kind of problem most armies considered impossible. After the First World War, the Corps had been under pressure at home. It was small. It was expensive. Some people in Washington saw it as redundant. If the Army could fight land wars and the Navy could command the sea, then what was the purpose of a separate Marine Corps? The Marines survived by choosing a mission almost nobody else wanted to own, taking defended islands from the sea. That sounds simple only if you have never imagined it honestly. A beach is not an open door. A beach is a killing lane. The defender knows where you must arrive. The attacker comes in wet, crowded, visible, and exposed. The boats can ground. The radios can fail. The tide can betray you. The first men ashore may die before they even reach cover. Gallipoli had shown the world what modern weapons could do to landing troops. For many military thinkers, large-scale amphibious assault against a prepared shore was not merely difficult. It was close to impossible. The Marines spent the 1920s and 1930s studying that impossibility like a craftsman studies a flaw in steel. They built doctrine. They experimented with landing craft. They trained naval gunfire coordination. They practiced small unit initiative. They taught men that the plan was important, but the collapse of the plan was not an excuse to stop acting. That last lesson mattered most, because in the Pacific plans collapsed constantly. Jungle swallowed units, reefs stopped boats, command posts disappeared under shellfire, maps lied, radios died. The Corps had not trained men to expect a perfect operation. It had trained them to continue after perfection died. That is why Japanese commanders found them so hard to read. Imperial doctrine placed enormous weight on hierarchy, obedience, and the spiritual will of the unit. It could produce disciplined and ferocious soldiers. It could produce men who would fight to the death in places no ordinary person could endure. But it often expected the officer to remain the mind of the body. Remove the mind, and the body should falter. The Marines had built something different. They had copied pieces of the mind downward, into lieutenants, into sergeants, into corporals, into fire teams. So when the head was struck, the body did not simply thrash. It kept moving with purpose. Tarawa made that quality visible in the most brutal way. In November of 1943, the Marines came for Bidio, a tiny island in the Tarawa atoll. The Japanese commander, Rear Admiral Keiji Shibazaki, had built a defense that looked almost mathematically cruel. Roughly 4,700 defenders, coastal guns, artillery, hundreds of machine gun positions, bunkers and trenches packed onto a strip of coral barely 2 miles long. There was no soft place to land. Then the tide failed the attackers. Many landing craft hung up on the reef, hundreds of yards from shore. Marines had to climb out and walk through the lagoon under fire. Chest-deep water. Rifles held high. Men falling before they reached the beach. Units torn apart before they became units at all. A lesser assault would have become a disaster story. This one became something more disturbing to the defenders, because the formal shape of the attack broke, but the attack did not stop. There were no perfect waves anymore, no clean formation, no neat command rhythm. There were Marines moving in ones, twos, and handfuls, a man behind a seawall, a wounded corporal pulling others forward, a group forming around a flamethrower, a rifleman crawling toward a bunker, because that bunker was still killing men in the water. The Japanese defense had been built to destroy an assault. It succeeded. Then the pieces of the destroyed assault kept fighting. That was the problem. After 76 hours, Baitio was taken. Nearly the entire Japanese garrison was dead. The Marines paid terribly for the island, and Tarawa shocked the American public when the images and casualty reports came home. But to Japanese analysts, Tarawa carried another warning. Even when the beach itself became a machine for killing, the Marines still pushed the mission forward, not because they did not understand danger, because they had been trained to act inside it. By 1944, Japan had begun to adapt. No serious Japanese commander could still believe that one glorious night charge would throw Marines into the sea. The evidence was too strong. Guadalcanal had not been a fluke. Tarawa had not been a fluke. So the defenses changed. At Peleliu, Colonel Kunio Nakagawa built a different kind of problem. He did not waste men on theatrical charges. He used caves, ridgelines, concealed positions, and interlocking fire. He turned the island into a system of pain. The idea was not merely to repel the Marines in one dramatic moment. It was to bleed them slowly. The assault began on September 15, 1944. The operation was expected to be short. It lasted more than 2 months. Heat hammered the island. Coral cut men open. Ridges became fortresses. Every yard demanded another answer. Here was Japan's professional response to the Marines. Do not try to frighten them. Make every step cost too much. And for a time, it looked like the only answer that made sense. Peleliu proved that Marine excellence did not make Marines invulnerable. It did not cancel artillery. It did not cancel exhaustion. It did not make coral soft or caves easy. The cost was horrific. But the deeper question for Japan was not whether Marines could be killed. Of course they could be killed. The question was whether enough killing would stop the system. On Peleliu, the system slowed. It suffered. It bled. It did not stop. That was the nightmare for a defender. Not an enemy who feels no pain. An enemy who feels it and converts it into procedure. Take cover, find the fire, move the gun, bring up explosives, shift left, mark the cave, try again. Again, 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 Iwo Jima carried that nightmare to its most famous form. By early 1945, Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi had studied the American way of island assault carefully. He understood that open beaches and reckless charges would not defeat the Marines. So he built inward and downward tunnels, caves, blockhouses, hidden guns, mutual support. A volcanic island turned into a fortress beneath the ground. Roughly 22,000 Japanese defenders waited there. Kuribayashi's goal was not to win in the ordinary sense. He knew Japan's strategic position was desperate. His goal was to make the island cost so much that America would feel the price of every future landing. On February 19, 1945, the Marines came ashore. The black volcanic sand fought them before the Japanese fire fully opened. Men sank into it. Vehicles struggled. Digging was miserable. The beach gave almost nothing back. Then the island began firing. Iwo Jima became 36 days of caves, flame, grenades, tunnels, ridges, counterfire, and close assault. The Marines suffered about 26,000 casualties, including nearly 7,000 killed. It was one of the rare Pacific battles where American casualties exceeded Japanese casualties. And still the island was taken. That sentence is easy to say and almost impossible to understand. Still, the island was taken. It hides the thousands of small continuations inside it. A squad leader gone, and another Marine points. A machine gunner hit, and someone drags the weapon forward. A platoon confused by smoke, and a corporal remembers the objective. A cave cleared, and then another cave appears. A ridge gained, and then the ridge behind it opens fire. The Japanese had built a defense around destroying the visible structure of the attack. They smashed units. They killed officers. They cut communications. They shattered timetables. But the structure they needed to destroy was no longer fully visible. It had already been installed inside the smaller parts. That is why Japanese prisoners and officers, when describing Marines, often return to the same idea in different language. They did not seem to wait for permission. They did not seem to collapse when leadership fell. They did not behave like men whose purpose had to be handed down every minute from above. They behaved as if every man carried a copy of the larger mission. Not perfectly, not magically, not without fear, but often enough to change battles. This is also why the Marine reputation cannot be explained by the word courage alone. Courage was everywhere in the Pacific. Japanese soldiers fought with terrifying courage. Army units fought with courage. Navy corpsmen moved through fire with courage. Seabees, pilots, sailors, coast watchers, and infantrymen in every uniform saw things that demanded courage. The Marine difference was not that they owned bravery. No fighting force owns bravery. The difference was institutional. The Corps had selected, trained, argued, studied, and prepared for a narrow kind of war until the narrowness became strength. Amphibious assault was not a side job. It was the central problem. The Marines had been built around it until the mission shaped the men. That is what Japan finally had to face. Not just stronger equipment, not just industrial abundance, not just more ships and planes. A culture of assault that could survive the breakdown of its own outer form. By Okinawa in 1945, Japanese officers were no longer asking whether Marines were dangerous. That question had been answered on too many islands. The question became whether anything could stop them before Japan itself. Colonel Hiromichi Yahara, one of the senior Japanese staff officers on Okinawa, watched American forces grind forward through one of the last great battles of the war. He saw what cave positions could do. He saw what artillery could do. He saw how mud, ridges, tombs, rain, and fortified lines could slow the advance. Slow it, punish it, delay it, not stop it. That distinction matters. A defense can be brilliant and still fail. A commander can make the correct professional choice and still lose. A soldier can fight with honor and still be overcome by a system better fitted to the problem. The Japanese commanders who understood this were not insulting their own men when they recognized the Marines' excellence. They were describing the shape of reality. They had built defenses to break morale. The Marines had built training that functioned after morale was wounded. They had built defenses to kill leaders. The Marines had built initiative below the leaders. They had built defenses to make the battlefield impossible. The Marines had spent decades rehearsing what to do when the battlefield became impossible. That was the difference. The famous flag raising on Mount Suribachi became the image the world remembered. It deserved its place. It captured a moment of physical victory in a place still full of death. But the deeper truth of the Pacific Marine story is not in the flag alone. It is in what happened before and after the photograph. Men climbed, dug, crawled, carried, aimed, adjusted, and continued in terrain designed to erase them. 3 of the 6 men in that image would not survive the battle. The island was not finished when the flag went up. The tunnels still held men. The killing still had days and weeks to run. The photograph shows triumph. The campaign explains the price of the word, and from the Japanese side that price produced a hard professional respect. Not romance, not mythology, not the clean language of posters. Respect for a force that did not behave the way defenders needed it to behave. Japan's best soldiers could die in place. Japan's best officers could build smarter defenses. Japan's best planners could study the last island and improve the next one. But again and again, they found the same central problem waiting for them. How do you stop an enemy that has trained for the moment, when stopping should have become natural? How do you break a chain of command when the chain has been copied into the links? How do you defeat men whose institution has taught them that fear, confusion, hunger, and loss are not exceptions to the mission? They are the weather around it. That is why the enemy descriptions still matter. Because the most honest Japanese assessments were not saying the Marines were supernatural. They were saying the opposite. They were saying this was not magic. This was construction. A force built over years, refined through doctrine, hardened by training, tested under conditions that punished every weakness, and carried by men who were afraid, tired, wounded, and human. Human is the important word. The legend becomes smaller when it pretends the Marines did not feel fear. The truth is larger. They felt it. They carried it. And they acted anyway. Not only because they were brave, but because an institution had taught them what action should look like when bravery alone was no longer enough. Japan called them many things in fear, anger, and grudging respect. But the clearest description was never the name, it was the pattern. A landing force cut off and still holding, a ridge nearly broken and still alive, a reef turned into a slaughter lane and still crossed, an island hollowed into tunnels and still taken, a command structure shattered again and again, and still somehow present. Not above the Marines, inside them.